Outrage over the U.S. vetoing a UN Security Council resolution calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It also demanded the unrestricted entry of aid to the Strip. But while Israel is bombing and starving Palestinians, will any UN resolution make a difference? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Another UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza blocked by the U.S. It's the fifth time Washington has used its veto power since Israel's war began in October 2023. The U.S. says it will continue to support its close ally, while Israel says it will continue the war in Gaza until Hamas is defeated. So, do the veto powers of the Permanent Security Council members undermine the body itself? Even when resolutions are passed, does the UN have the capability to enact them? We'll get to our panel of guests in a moment, but first, this report by Imogen Kimber.
Dying of starvation or being killed in an Israeli attack. The daily fears of Palestinians in Gaza. It's what a UN Security Council resolution tried to end, calling for a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, an end to the blockade on humanitarian aid, and the release of the remaining captives still held in Gaza.
This draft resolution had a simple goal: demanding a ceasefire that would allow the beginning of the monumental work needed to end the horrific humanitarian situation, to stop the genocide, to release hostages and prisoners, and to get the Israeli occupying forces out of Gaza.
All 10 non-permanent members voted in favour, as did 4 of the Council's permanent members: China, France, Russia and the UK.
14 votes in favour, 1 vote against.
But the US used its veto power to block the motion.
The United States has been clear. We would not support any measure that fails to condemn Hamas and does not call for Hamas to disarm and leave Gaza.
China says the US is abusing its position.
Because of its shielding of Israel, several resolutions adopted by the Council have not been effectively implemented. Claims that Security Council actions would interfere with diplomatic efforts are completely untenable. As long as diplomatic efforts are genuinely aimed for peace, the actions of the Council will only provide strong support.
Since Israel's war began in October 2023, the UN Security Council has voted on 14 Gaza-related resolutions. The US vetoed 5 of them. But 4 were adopted. They demanded a pause in fighting or that more humanitarian aid be allowed into the Strip. However, the resolutions weren't effective or lasting. In most cases, Israeli bombardment continued, and the call for Hamas to release the captives was not heeded. Israel has accused the UN of anti-Semitism and reiterated its war goals.
We haven't finished the job. We will not finish the war leaving behind 58 people. There are families waiting for them, and we are committed to finish this war by making sure the hostages are back and Hamas is out of the game.
Which prompts the question, even if the UN Security Council did pass a resolution, how would it be enforced on the ground in Gaza? Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. From San Francisco, we're joined by Stephen Zunes, a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. In Rome, Luigi Daniele, associate professor of international law at Molise University. And in London is Firas El Echi, a journalist and host of the Here's Why podcast. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Firas, let me start with you today. Let's say that this resolution had passed. Even if the United States had voted in favor of the resolution, or if the U.S. had abstained when the vote had happened, if this resolution had passed, would it have actually made a difference on the ground in Gaza?
Hello, and thank you for having me. Unfortunately, we are in times where resolutions, words, and positions matters not. The situation is of disparity, the situation of a level of inhumanity that unless it's supported by actual actions, nothing really matters. Any difference right now should be in terms of actions. Those powers, let's take France, the UK, Germany, who have shifted drastically in terms of their positions, unless they follow that by actions, it really doesn't matter. People are starving. Tomorrow is the Eid for Muslims. It's a big celebration, and Eid al-Adha is supposed to be a celebration where people gather around food, none of which exists in Gaza right now. And the UN is saying in the next 48 hours, we might see 14,000 children dying from starvation. So by the time you even pass the ceasefire, nothing will change. By the time you would say, all right, we're going to move forward with talks, nothing would change. Unless you really support this by action, forcing the hand of Israel to withdraw fully from Gaza, nothing matters. These positions, especially, again, the UK, France, and Germany, with their strong condemnations, unless they're followed by actions, it matters not. And yesterday, France was shipping ammunition. The UK continues to send scraps of F-35s, and the US continues to provide this umbrella. So for now, the situation is of such despair that any position matters not. We're far beyond diplomacy right now.
Luigi, I saw you reacting there to what Firas was saying, specifically when he was talking about how essentially it's that actions are needed, as he was saying, not words. Let me ask you, while Israel is continuing to bomb Gaza and while Palestinians in Gaza are continuing to starve, from your vantage point, is there any type of UN resolution, whether through the Security Council or by the UN General Assembly, that would actually have an impact and make a difference on the ground?
I don't think that per se a UN resolution could save the tragic situation that has gone well beyond the thresholds established by the Genocide Convention. We would actually need action. And the only thing I want to add to the comments of the previous colleague is that this action is not action that governments can frame as politically discretionary. These are actions that are mandated by international legal obligations. States would have a cogent obligation to prevent genocide, its commission, but even worse, its successful completion. And it's not true that Western states and in general third states are powerless, even without UN resolutions. Without more of them, they have already these legal duties. For example, imposing sanctions, for example, imposing a total arms embargo. The totality of the human rights NGOs in the world, the near totality of UN independent experts, all actors of conscience worldwide are demanding strongly so. So this is really the time to act. It's too late to save the dozens of thousands of Palestinian civilians and children slaughtered, but it's not too late to save those that without action are going to die horribly in the next few hours and days.
Stephen, let me come to you next. Once again, you have the United States here that's essentially against the rest of the UN Security Council when it comes to Gaza. Where does this most recent U.S. veto leave the humanitarian and political crisis in Gaza going forward?
Unfortunately, it leaves it pretty much the same, which is worsening every day. The United States has used its veto power more than any other country or at least since the 1967 war. The United States has used its veto power in the United Nations more than any other permanent members. It's used its veto power, I believe, 87 times at this point. Over half of those, or slightly more than half, were in regard to Israel. And in every single one of these votes, the United States was the sole dissenter. I mean, I think this underscores, what an international outlier the United States is. And I mean, it's not the only country that's used its veto power. We saw how the Russians vetoed a number of very reasonable UN Security Council resolutions trying to end the mass killing in Syria during that country's civil war. But the United States is playing a similar obstructionist position here, and the humanitarian consequences, as Al Jazeera and other media have been covering, is absolutely horrendous. And as you're noting earlier, even if the resolution had passed, it would not have necessarily ended the crisis unless it was put under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which gives the Security Council the authority to impose sanctions and other concrete measures. Even when the United States has allowed a resolution critical of Israel to pass, as it has occasionally, not often, but sometimes, the U.S. has blocked it from being under Chapter 7, where there could actually be a means by the international community to end the suffering.
Firas, you heard Stephen there talking about how often the U.S. has used its veto power when it comes to the UN Security Council in the past. Let me ask you, does the veto power, from your perspective, of permanent Security Council members, does that undermine the UN Security Council? And if so, how much does it undermine it? How much does it impact its credibility?
We've faced situations like this before, whether it was in Iraq, Afghanistan, but nothing was as consistent and corruptible and also indicting to the U.S. as this one. For 2 years, we had all the proof we need to conclude that there's a genocide happening, that there's a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented level since World War II happening. Matthew Miller finally, after having left the State Department, spoke out and said we were sure that there are war crimes taking place. And for the United States to come out and still defend Israel, to come out and still veto such decisions, she reminds me yesterday, the representative of the US in the Security Council, of a gesture done by Gaddafi 20 years ago. Even though of a different tone, of a different choice of words, she took that charter and threw it against the wall. Because if this is not a humanitarian crisis where we need to vote collectively, then what is? Right now, the U.S. is shifting sides, and right now the U.S. is choosing to become the very evil that it always lectured us against. It is undermining the UN, it is undermining the purpose of the UN, and once the credibility of this organism falls apart, which is, by the way, we might see the emergence of different bodies, and we might not have that nations and forces that might come out in the future and say we are the forces of good, because these double standards between what's happening in Ukraine and in Palestine, in the future you cannot come out as the virtuous side to talk about Taiwan or anything else. So not only the US is being corrupted by making these choices, but yes, it is undermining the point of the UN. How could we move forward after this? Honestly, I don't know.
Luigi, you were speaking a few moments ago about politically discretionary actions versus obligations when it comes to international humanitarian law, if I understood you correctly. I want to ask you more specifically about some of the resolutions that had actually passed in the last several months and that had demanded a pause in fighting, or that more humanitarian aid needs to be allowed in the Strip. Did those resolutions actually have an impact on the ground at the time they were passed?
They did have an impact, and they did have an impact not only in saving the lives of Palestinians, but also in facilitating the process for the release of the hostages. Most of the hostages that have been liberated through negotiations and deals, surely not via bombardments or indiscriminate killing, which, by the way, has already killed some of the hostages by means of the Israeli forces' fire. So what we are seeing is, I think, far beyond a humanitarian situation, because, we use this term even for natural disaster or catastrophes. Here, everything, every inch of suffering, all the segments of the ordeal of pain and violations inflicted on Palestinians is entirely man-made, included the famine as a consequence of the policy of mass starvation. So those resolutions had an effect in pointing toward the current climate. The lies are crumbling. It is evident to every observer of conscience in the world that these crimes are being committed without any meaningful military necessity, there are not a way forward in anything, if not more slaughter, depopulation of Gaza, depopulation of the West Bank. Basically, the Israeli government is using the word Hamas as a rhetorical figure to indicate the entirety of the Palestinian population. So that's why I insist on the legal obligations. There are cogent duties of states, now reinforced by all the pronunciation of the International Court of Justice, the provisional measures, the advisory opinion on the unlawfulness of the Israeli occupation. There is no choice for third state. And actually, we are going in a new direction. The Israeli brutal regime is more and more isolated in the world. It's them and Trump against the entirety of the world. And we know that without consent, they won't be able anymore to continue. So the time of action for third states, including the Gulf states, is now.
Stephen, you heard Luigi there say that Israel is becoming more and more isolated internationally. There is mounting outrage over this latest U.S. veto. China, for example, says the U.S. is abusing its position. How isolated, from your perspective, is the U.S. becoming, and what does that mean going forward? Is there a point that the U.S. shifts its position at all when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the UN Security Council, or does this continue to play out in this fashion?
I mean, even putting aside the obvious moral and legal arguments against the U.S. position, is really hurting the United States' credibility in the world. I mean, how can we criticize Russia's war crimes in Ukraine if we are supporting Israeli war crimes? How can we say that Russia has no right to expand its borders by force? That no country can unilaterally change its international boundaries when we endorse Israel's illegal annexation of Greater East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the large swaths of the West Bank for these illegal settlements. I mean, you go down the list. I mean, American in international relations, it's just, a country's power is not just in terms of the strength of its military, but what people call soft power. That is the ability of people to take a country seriously when it talks about the goals and of its foreign policy and how the international order should be. And so, even that's why even very mainstream American analysts, those who are not anti-Zionist, who are not anti-Israel, who just are and might even not subscribe to high moral standards in terms of civilian casualties. Even among these people, there's a growing criticism of what the U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine is doing in terms of our international reputation. People throughout the world, particularly the global South, are going to be looking more towards Europe, maybe even Russia and China, instead of the United States, which has long prided itself as the global leader, as the defender of the post-World War II international legal order. And when we abandon it, it gives excuse for extremists and terrorists and others around the world to say, well, if the United States isn't willing to abide by international law and these international standards, despite all its power and influence, why should we?
Luigi, the UK's ambassador to the UN, Barbara Woodward, she said this Israeli government's decision to expand its military operations in Gaza and severely restrict aid are unjustifiable, disproportionate, and counterproductive. We know, obviously, she's criticizing Israel here, but can these words that we heard from Ambassador Woodward, can they also be taken as criticism of the U.S. veto?
Absolutely, yes. The UK position is shifting as well as that of other governments and several governments of EU states is not shifting enough. What I feel they are doing is that they are trying to disconnect what people in the world have understood, that this is not only an Israeli genocide, but is a genocide perpetrated with the full complicity of a big chunk of Western ruling classes, and are trying to disassociate themselves from this stain that will mark forever the history of this century, not only for shame reasons, but also because the atrocities in Gaza are producing a wave of mass repoliticization in Western societies, in particular the younger generations. I want to tell you one thing I feel the duty to underline. I have read this morning that Save the Children UK has received testimonies from Gaza children who are telling their volunteers, we want to die. We don't want to be here anymore. We want to go where our parents who have been killed are. We want to go in heaven where there is food and water. Tell me in what way any government with an inch of moral decency can continue to just talk and avoid taking measures again that are mandatory under international law, like economic sanctions, massive, until the violations end and the full arms embargo. Without these two essential measures, the action of Western governments is tantamount to saying that the Palestinian people can be totally eliminated.
Firas, you heard Luigi there talk about the fact that the UK's position, as he said, might be shifting, and other allies of Israel, that their positions might be shifting when it comes to Israel's conduct in the war. Some of Israel's closest allies, including the UK, France, and Canada, they've been demanding big changes in its conduct in Gaza, especially when it comes to allowing in humanitarian aid. Does what we've been hearing from some of these countries signal to you that more action will actually be taken by them?
To be honest, I don't believe in that. I don't have faith in that. I saw for the last 2 years this diplomacy game of stalling, of condemning, of coming back and forth, that we know what Netanyahu is all about. We know the intentions. We know that they want to turn this to an unlivable hell, which it already is. Google Maps, by the way, just this week updated the pictures in Gaza, and I invite people to go and see. It gives me shivers down my spine. I felt the blood freezing in my veins, and I am sure the head of those government have better intelligence to know exactly what's happening. The urgency of the situation requires very strong actions very soon. So yeah, it's very important that they shifted position, but obviously because there's nothing to defend anymore. We're far beyond Israel's right to defend itself. A genocide is unfolding. A famine of unprecedented levels since World War II is taking place. But condemning, shifting positions, saying strong statements, this is not gonna save the hungry kids who already saw their siblings dying. Their parents are in another part or lost or maybe gone. This is just a situation where actions need to be taken. And the challenge that Macron is facing, that the UK government is facing, that Canada is facing, is of unprecedented level and requires unprecedented actions. Where we go from here, I hope that they wake up. I hope that they take action against Netanyahu's government because, like I said, tomorrow is Eid and people are going to be starving.
Stephen, let me ask you, from your vantage point, why is Israel facing more pressure from some of its close allies at this stage? I mean, Spain has called for an arms embargo on Israel. The UK has paused trade talks. They've sanctioned a number of Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. Canada and France have threatened punitive measures. Why is the pressure ramping up now? And do you believe that this is anything more than just being diplomatically symbolic?
I think some of these measures are having some impact. And that it's a warning to, I think, many elements of Israeli society, not the pro-Netanyahu, hardline ideologues, militarist, overt racist, but for example, the more mainstream Israeli business community and others who are interested in having normal relations with the Western world. And so, this may hit some of them in the pocketbook. Might have some impact. Might get them to pressure their government a little more. But I think more importantly, I think in many ways, is showing the Israeli people how isolated they are becoming. So I think this does have some impact. But I think that what it represents more than anything is global civil society. I mean, these European countries, these other countries, have not always led to consistently moral foreign policies themselves. When you look at some of their allies elsewhere in the Middle East and in Africa and elsewhere, but they're responding to global civil society that we've seen. As an American, I've seen how it was popular pressure in the United States to change U.S. policy towards Vietnam, towards Central America, towards Southern Africa, even relatively obscure conflicts like Timor-Leste, East Timor. And so I think what we're seeing right now in Europe and the United States and around the world is that global civil society, as it did during, for example, the BDS campaign targeting apartheid South Africa, is saying, hey, folks, you got to respond to this. So this is a reflection, I think, more than anything else, is not of some sudden measure of conscience, by the European leaders, but that they have to listen to their people who are absolutely horrified at what's going on and are demanding their governments take action. I'm sorry the United States is a little behind Europe in that regard, but the movement here is growing as well.
Luigi, more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza are desperate for food and water. The UN has called Gaza the hungriest place on earth. How much credibility has the UN lost as a result of what is happening in Gaza? And what does it say overall about the state of diplomacy, that the so-called international community cannot actually stop what's going on?
Yes, let me tell you something about the starvation first. There is one of the genocidal conduct prohibited by the Genocide Convention, which is often misunderstood. It talks about deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about total or partial destruction of a group. It means that this genocidal conduct is committed by putting in motion the causal processes that will bring about the destruction, which means that not a single person should need to have died in order for the crime to be configured. So this genocidal conduct is being committed since so long ago. Starvation is per se a war crime, but in this context is a genocidal conduct. The fact that the UN is failing to take robust action, I think, talks more about how corrupt are the ruling classes of the states that should enforce international legality, rather than the UN itself. Often blaming the UN is a way to shift conflictuality away from our executives and toward the more immaterial supranational institutions. There's no way this time. The first responsible are the states, the Western states, those in which big profits are still being extracted from Palestinian civilians' blood, and which Western ruling classes have decided to protect. I think what my colleagues were saying is very appropriate. The shifting political approaches are not for moral stances, are because our public powers are understanding that this is not going to go away, that European and even US young generations are horrified and will never trust again a single politician that has contributed to this man-made catastrophe, man-made Nakba, not humanitarian crisis.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to our guests, Stephen Zunes, Luigi Daniele, and Firas El Echi. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.